You need to move. Now. That was the first sentence spoken to her on the plane. Not a "good morning." Not a "may I see your ticket." Just that. The flight attendant's voice cracked through the first-class cabin like a whip, sharp, public, and dripping with something too old and too familiar. And suddenly, the world shrank around Amara Benson. She wasn't causing a scene. She wasn't even speaking. She had simply taken her assigned seat, 2A, first class. And for that, she was being asked to stand up and prove she belonged. The man in 2B glanced sideways, then looked away. The woman across the aisle clutched her handbag closer. The hum of the air vents filled the silence. Not a single passenger spoke up. Because this wasn't their problem. Not really. Just a misunderstanding. Just a girl in the wrong seat. Just a black girl in the wrong seat. Amara didn't flinch. Not yet. She sat with her hands gently folded in her lap, her boarding pass tucked into the side pocket of her carry-on. She had arrived early, boarded early, and found her place. And for a moment, before Ms. Dalton arrived, the world had felt peaceful. She could still hear her godmother's voice from that morning, "You earned this, Amara. Sit like you belong there. Because you do." Now, under the fluorescent glare of the cabin lights, with a dozen heads turned toward her, that confidence began to peel. It had started as a quiet morning. Amara wore a navy windbreaker, simple black leggings, and a soft white t-shirt. Her box braids were pulled into a low bun. She looked exactly like any other 18-year-old flying home from a long week, tired, thoughtful, alert. But she wasn't just any girl. She had just completed a month-long advanced STEM residency at a university lab in Chicago, one of only 5 students nationally selected, and the only black woman. Her experiments in renewable battery design had landed her a finalist spot in a national competition. The first-class ticket was a gift from her godmother, Amara Benson, who had called her the night before and said, "Don't argue. You're not flying coach after that achievement." It wasn't luxury. It was recognition. But apparently, it was too much recognition for someone like her. When the boarding group was called, Amara walked up to the gate agent with her ID and e-ticket already ready. The scan beeped green. The gate agent smiled and gestured her through. No one questioned her then. She stepped onto the jet bridge, her carry-on light, her nerves calm. She didn't expect applause. She didn't need approval. She just wanted a seat in some quiet. Row 2 was already half full. She slid into her seat, placed her backpack at her feet, and pulled out the novel she had been trying to finish for weeks. She hadn't even opened it yet when she saw her, Ms. Dalton. Sharp jawline. Pale skin. Thin frame wrapped in a crisp blue uniform. Her steps were loud and punctuated by narrow glances. She passed by with a clipboard, nodding at other passengers. Then she stopped. She stopped right at Amara. Their eyes met. Ms. Dalton blinked once, slowly, like she needed a moment to recalibrate what she was seeing. Then the voice came. "You need to move. Now." No question. No smile. Just a verdict. Amara frowned. "Sorry," she said, her voice soft but clear. Ms. Dalton's lip tightened. "This is first class, sweetheart." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The man in the row ahead peeked over his shoulder. "I know," Amara replied calmly. "This is my seat. 2A." Ms. Dalton's eyebrow lifted with theatrical doubt. "May I see your boarding pass?" Amara reached down without a word and retrieved the paper slip. Ms. Dalton snatched it without thanks, glanced at it once, then looked back at Amara as though reading hadn't helped at all. "This must be an error," she muttered. "There's no way." She caught herself. But not quickly enough. Amara tilted her head. No way, what? Ms. Dalton pressed her lips into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Just, wait here. I'll check with the gate. She didn't move. She didn't need to. She had already made a decision. I'm afraid you'll have to move to the back while we sort this out. Amara's voice dropped just slightly. Sort what out, exactly? Miss, this is holding up boarding. I have a ticket, Amara said. She wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't making a scene. She was making a point. You need to move, Ms. Dalton repeated, louder this time, for the cabin to hear. A new kind of silence fell over first class. The kind where everyone hears something wrong but pretends they didn't. The kind that tastes like complicity. Amara could feel it settling on her shoulders, tightening her chest. She looked at the window. Her seat. The other passengers. None of them looked back. And then, like every young black woman taught to pick her battles wisely, Amara stood. She reached down, grabbed her bag, and walked down the aisle, every step heavier than the last. Her ears burned. Her breath quickened. Not from fear. From humiliation. She reached the back of the plane, sat by the window, and pulled her phone from her bag. She didn't draft a long explanation. She didn't vent. She just typed. She made me move. Said I didn't belong in first class. She hit send. Seconds later, the phone buzzed. Clara, what's your flight number? Amara stared out the window. Engines rumbled beneath the floor. The sun cut a harsh light across the tarmac. She took a breath and responded. 2 words from Clara came back. Stay there. Amara tucked the phone into her jacket pocket and exhaled. She had no idea what Clara was doing. She only knew what she wasn't going to do. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to apologize. She wasn't going to disappear. Amara didn't need to raise her voice. She just needed to stay still. Because some storms don't begin with thunder. They begin in silence. And this one had just started. The plane was still taxiing when the ground below began to shift, not from turbulence, but from something else. In row 28F, Amara sat frozen, her body present, her mind racing. The vibration from her phone had stopped, but its weight now seemed heavier than her carry-on. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the moment just after the breath before the storm. Across the airport, inside a tall gray federal building with tinted glass and badge-restricted doors, Amara Benson stood in her office barefoot, her heels kicked off beside her desk. She had read the message twice. Then a third time. She said I didn't belong in first class. The words weren't long. But they had weight. Because Clara had been there before, not on a plane, but in a conference room, a board meeting, a government hearing, where someone looked at her credentials, then looked at her face, and decided she didn't fit. But this time, they had picked the wrong girl. Because Clara didn't just write policy. She enforced it. She was the director of National Aviation Oversight, the person whose name could pause an entire airline with a single compliance alert. She picked up her secure line and dialed. Get me ground control for Flight 719. Flag it for immediate delay. On board, the hum of the engines continued. Amara stared out the window, watching the slow crawl of the aircraft away from the gate. Her seatbelt was fastened, her hands unmoving, but her heart beat steadily in her ears. She didn't know what Clara would do. She only knew that Clara never called unless it mattered. A flight attendant passed by with a polite smile, not Ms. Dalton. This one, a younger man with warm eyes and a visible tension in his jaw. His name tag read Marcelo. He paused, glanced at her seat, then kept walking. He didn't say anything. But he had noticed her. In the front cabin, Ms. Dalton stood with her arms crossed near the galley, sipping from a paper cup. Her expression had settled into satisfaction. Order, in her mind, had been restored. She wasn't malicious. Not in her own eyes. She believed she had followed instinct. Years of watching, guessing, and profiling. And years of never being questioned. But that was about to change. In the cockpit, the pilot's secure line lit up. Captain Richard Monroe was a 25-year veteran of the skies. He had flown during ice storms, airspace lockdowns, and even emergency landings. But he had never received a priority override like this, directly from the FAA. The voice on the other end was clipped, formal. "This is Operations Officer Julian Grant, National Oversight Division, calling on behalf of Director Clara Benson. Do you have a passenger by the name Amara Benson on board?" "Yes," Captain Monroe said, his voice steady. Seated now in, he checked the manifest, 28F. She was assigned to 2A, the voice confirmed. Yes. There was a seating issue. "There's no issue," Grant replied. "The director has flagged this flight. You are to halt taxiing and return to the gate. This is an immediate compliance concern." Captain Monroe blinked. "Is this confirmed?" "It's beyond confirmed," Grant replied. "The director herself has invoked Federal Clause 4B, Passenger Discrimination Response Protocol. I don't think I need to tell you what that means." The pilot exhaled slowly. "No. You don't." He ended the call, turned to his co-pilot, and said quietly, "We're not taking off." The overhead speakers clicked. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've just received notification of a delay due to a procedural check from ground operations. We will remain at the gate until further notice. We appreciate your patience." The announcement was neutral. But it dropped like a boulder in the cabin. First-class passengers shifted. One man muttered, "Typical." The woman across from 2A adjusted her scarf and whispered, "I knew something was off." Back in 28F, Amara closed her eyes. It was the beginning. In the airline's central operations hub, an alert flashed across several screens. FAA Intervention Flag, Flight 719. Reason, Passenger Rights Investigation. Compliance Level, Red. At first, the staff assumed it was a mechanical misfile. Then the name attached to the file scrolled across. Clara Benson, DOA Oversight Director. Every terminal in the command center snapped into action. Inside the corporate headquarters of the airline, a junior legal assistant burst into the office of Chief Ethics Officer Susan Holbrook. "There's a hold on Flight 719 from Chicago. FAA just called it. Passenger discrimination." Susan looked up from her lunch, stunned. "Do we have video?" "Waiting for gate feed now. FAA wants our response in the next 30 minutes. Call PR, draft something neutral. Now." Back in the aircraft, tension grew like fog. Marcelo, the kind-eyed attendant, approached Ms. Dalton quietly. "Hey," he said, voice low. "About earlier." She turned, annoyed. "What?" "That girl, 2A. She showed you her ticket, didn't she?" "She was in the wrong seat." "But the ticket said 2A. "I've worked here for 17 years, she said sharply. "I know when something doesn't feel right." Marcelo stared at her. She was calm. She didn't argue. "And now we're being held at the gate. So." Marcelo paused. Then said, "I think you should be careful about how you remember this. He walked away. 10 rows back, Amara's phone buzzed again. She didn't jump. Clara, flight grounded. FAA notified. Do not speak to anyone. I'm not done yet. Amara stared at the message. She could feel the cabin's energy shift, passengers growing restless, whispers creeping down the aisle like vines. But no one had said anything to her. No apology. No explanation. Just quiet. Ms. Dalton passed by once, avoiding eye contact. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't need a scene. She had a witness. And that witness wore a federal badge. In the front of the plane, the cockpit received a second call. This one wasn't just a delay confirmation. It was a compliance escalation. The voice was different, a woman this time. This is Special Advisor Rhodes, FAA Intervention Division. We are dispatching a compliance team to meet your aircraft on the ground. The crew member involved in the seat reassignment will be subject to questioning. Noted, the captain replied. Anything else? Yes, she said. Please instruct the senior flight attendant to prepare a statement of incident and inform them that FAA oversight will take possession of all crew logs upon landing. Captain Monroe sat back. This wasn't going away quietly. The cabin remained in a strange limbo. The engines were silent, but the emotions buzzed louder than ever. One man whispered, maybe it's mechanical. The woman beside him shook her head. No. This is something else. And finally, someone said it aloud. It's the girl. The one who got moved. Heads turned. Then looked away again. No one had defended her. But now, no one could ignore her. Amara sat with her back straight, hands folded, phone face down on her tray. She hadn't moved since Clara's last message. She didn't need to. She wasn't just waiting anymore. She was witnessing. And every minute the plane remained grounded, more eyes drifted toward her. She wasn't invisible now. She was the reason everything had stopped. And the woman who had tried to make her small was about to feel very, very seen. The moment the cockpit door opened, silence followed. Captain Monroe stepped out slowly, scanning the cabin like a man already calculating consequences. His jaw was firm, but his eyes revealed something else, restraint. He wasn't used to this kind of situation, not in his decades of flight time. Mechanical failures, he could handle. Turbulence, delays, angry passengers, all just part of the job. But this? This was different. He took 3 steps forward and stopped just short of the first-class galley. Ms. Dalton stood rigidly by the beverage cart, folding napkins as if order could be restored with origami. Ms. Dalton, the captain said, calm but clipped. She turned, startled. Yes, sir. I need you to come with me. A ripple of confusion passed through the front rows. The woman in one seat tilted her head, eyes narrowing. Ms. Dalton glanced at her, then back at the captain. She gave a brittle nod and followed him up the aisle, heels clicking like metronomes counting down to something irreversible. Inside the cockpit, the door closed behind her. The co-pilot vacated his seat, giving her room to sit. She didn't. She stood stiffly, hands clasped behind her back like a cadet awaiting judgment. The captain didn't speak at first. He tapped the communication panel, handed her a headset. You're going to want to hear this yourself, he said. She slipped it on, the cushion firm against her ears. A click followed, then a voice, unmistakably federal. This is James Sandler, FAA Operations Manager, speaking on behalf of Director Amara Benson. Ms. Dalton blinked. Her lips parted slightly. She knew the name. Everyone in aviation did. Director Benson was not a figurehead. She was the enforcer. She didn't give interviews. She signed authorizations. She restructured protocols. Her decisions made airlines recalibrate overnight. And now, apparently, she was calling about this flight. "We've been notified that a passenger, Amara Benson, was removed from her assigned seat under your direction," Sandler continued. "There appears to be no record of verification with ground staff or digital manifest." Ms. Dalton's mouth went dry. "She didn't appear to be a first-class passenger," she said, fumbling. I was following standard procedure." Sandler didn't raise his voice. That made it worse. "Did you scan her ticket?" I looked at it." "That's not what I asked." The silence was deafening. "Did you verify her boarding pass with ground agents or system logs before removing her?" Her throat tightened. "No, but..." "You made a judgment based on what?" Sandler pressed. "I thought she didn't belong there." And there it was. She had said it. Aloud. Into a federal line. The silence that followed wasn't passive. It was loaded. "You are to return to the passenger immediately," Sandler said. "Escort her back to her original seat. Apologize, clearly, and in the presence of passengers." A beat passed. "This flight will not move until that is done." Her voice came out as a whisper. "And after that? We'll be waiting when you land." When Ms. Dalton emerged from the cockpit, her face was pale. The eyes that had once scanned for control now darted in search of somewhere to hide. She didn't find it. First class watched her return like a performer walking back on stage after being booed. She didn't meet anyone's gaze. She stepped past the curtain divider and into economy. The air felt heavier here, as if everyone sensed something cracking in real time. Row 28F. The girl was still there. Back straight. Phone face down. Hands folded. Ms. Dalton paused. For the first time in her career, her practiced poise faltered. "Miss Benson," she began, crouching slightly. Her voice was tight, artificial. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your seat." Amara looked at her. Not up. Just at her. Her expression is unreadable. "I apologize for the confusion," Ms. Dalton added quickly. Amara's eyes didn't blink. "Confusion," she repeated. Ms. Dalton nodded. "Yes. An error in seating." "No," Amara replied, her voice soft but knife-sharp. "You checked my ticket. You saw my seat number. And you still told me to move." The words were quiet. But they cut. Nearby passengers, once pretending not to notice, turned ever so slightly toward the sound. Ms. Dalton shifted, her knees aching. "I may have made a mistake in judgment." Amara looked down at her phone. Typed. Sent. "She's here. Says it was a mistake." The reply came almost instantly. "Clara, make her say it." Amara stood. Slowly. The aisle felt narrower than before. "I'll go back," she said. "But I want to know something first." Ms. Dalton tensed. "Why did you assume I didn't belong in that seat?" Silence spread like spilled water. "You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket." "Just me." "Why?" The question wasn't loud. But the impact was seismic. Ms. Dalton's mouth opened, then closed. Her face twitched, emotions warring beneath the surface. Amara didn't flinch. She waited. "I misjudged you," Ms. Dalton finally said. Amara nodded once. "Say it." Ms. Dalton swallowed. Her voice cracked. "I misjudged you, because I assumed." And with that, the truth was no longer implied. It was spoken. Passengers heard it. Remembered it. Would repeat it. Amara didn't gloat. She simply picked up her bag. The walk back up the aisle was different this time. No shame. No shrinking. Just presence. She walked beside the woman who had tried to erase her, but now walked 2 steps behind her. When they reached seat 2A, Amara paused. She didn't look around for approval. She sat. Ms. Dalton stood awkwardly, unsure of what to say next. Her uniform felt tighter now. Less like armor, more like evidence. "If there's anything else you need," she murmured. Amara opened her book. Didn't look up. The conversation was over. Ms. Dalton turned and walked away, her steps uneven. She disappeared behind the galley curtain, but her presence didn't. The silence that followed was louder than applause. Back in the economy, the man in 28B leaned toward his seatmate. "She's back up front." The woman glanced toward the aisle, then looked down. "I didn't say anything earlier," she said quietly. He nodded. "Neither did I." They both stared forward, but their silence had changed. It wasn't ignorance anymore. It was acknowledgement. In first class, across from 2A, a man in a gray suit cleared his throat. He leaned toward Amara, voice low. "I saw what happened," he said. She didn't look up. "Did you?" He hesitated. "It was unfortunate." She closed her book gently. Looked up, one brow raised. "Unfortunate," she repeated. He adjusted his tie. "A misunderstanding." She tilted her head. "You mean a choice?" The words landed like stone. He didn't respond. Just sat back, suddenly smaller than before. From the galley, Marcello watched it all unfold. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence wasn't complicity. It was respect. And for the first time since Amara had boarded, someone on the crew wasn't pretending. He was witnessing. In the airline's downtown headquarters, emergency calls were stacking. The story had already leaked. A reporter with a source in the FAA had gotten a tip. A blog post was live. Teen removed from first class, FAA grounds entire flight. They didn't know the full story yet. But they would. And Amara Benson hadn't even started speaking. The cabin felt like a courtroom now. Except no one stood up to speak, and no judge called for order. But the silence was judicially weighted, tense, reflective. Like everyone on board had become a jury to a trial they never expected to witness. And Amara Benson, seated once more in 2A, had become the center of gravity. She didn't ask for it. She didn't want it. But silence, her silence, had redefined the space around her. When Ms. Dalton slipped behind the galley curtain, the hush she left behind wasn't relief. It was reckoning. A few rows back, a woman fidgeted with her seatbelt. She had glanced at Amara earlier when she was first removed, then looked away. Now she looked again, longer this time. But Amara didn't return the glance. She had nothing to offer the people who hadn't offered her anything when it mattered. In the cockpit, Captain Monroe rubbed the back of his neck. He had flown through lightning storms that rattled windows. He had made emergency landings with less turbulence than what he was now feeling from one single passenger and one catastrophic choice. The intercom crackled again. "This is FAA Intervention Officer Rhodes. We have a unit en route. ETA 10 minutes. Flight is to remain grounded. Prepare full crew reports for collection upon landing." "Understood," Monroe replied. "Should I notify the passenger involved?" "She's already been notified," the voice said. By her godmother. The line clicked off. Captain Monroe sat back in silence. The name, Clara Benson, echoed again in his head like a siren. Back in seat 2A, Amara pulled her phone from the tray table. She hadn't received a new message yet, but she didn't need one. She could feel the change without it. The energy had shifted. Not because people were angry, but because they were ashamed. They had watched her be humiliated. And they had let it happen. Not one voice had interrupted Ms. Dalton's commands. Not one question had been asked on her behalf. Not one ally had emerged in the moment when her dignity was up for public inspection. But now they watched her like they couldn't believe she was real. A girl who sat still and spoke softly, but made the entire plane stop moving. And they weren't sure if they were witnesses or co-defendants. A soft chime rang through the cabin. Another delay update. Passengers in coach began mumbling, eyes darting toward the front as if a giant secret were walking around in uniform. In row 6, a father leaned to his teenage son. "What's going on?" The son whispered, "It's the girl they moved earlier. She's back in first class now." "She caused all this?" the father asked. The boy shook his head. "I don't think so. I think they did." In the galley, Marcello leaned on the counter, arms crossed. He had seen flight attendants cross lines before, power trips, snide comments, even minor seat swaps based on shallow impressions. But this? This was different. This was a policy breach. This was federal. And worse, this was avoidable. He turned his head toward the jump seat where Ms. Dalton sat slumped. Her hands were clasped so tightly they trembled. "FAA is coming on board," he said flatly. She didn't look up. "They're going to want a statement." Still, she didn't move. Marcello stared at her for a beat longer, then said, "You know this isn't about a seat anymore, right?" "I didn't mean." He held up a hand. "You didn't mean to humiliate her. But you did. And the part that hurts. You were so sure you were right." Ms. Dalton closed her eyes. Back in 2A, Amara lifted the cover of her book again. She stared at the page, but didn't read. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't have to. The page, the words, they were a placeholder. A shield. A way to say, "I am here, but I don't owe you my gaze." Across the aisle, the man in 2B adjusted his watch. Then cleared his throat. I'm sorry. For earlier." Amara didn't look up. "For what?" He hesitated. "For not saying anything. I saw. I should've." She turned one page. "But you didn't." He winced. "No. I didn't." She closed the book. "What stopped you?" she asked. I don't know. I guess. I didn't want to get involved." Her eyes finally met his. "And now you are." He nodded. Slowly. With the weight of a man who realized his silence had chosen a side. At the rear of the aircraft, a flight attendant named Heather, one of the junior crew, stepped into the galley and looked at Ms. Dalton. "I just got a message from gate control," she said softly. "They're sending someone to meet us." "FAA." Ms. Dalton nodded, more a twitch than a movement. Heather glanced at Marcello, then back at her. "You want to talk to her before they get here?" Ms. Dalton shook her head, almost imperceptibly. "I don't think it matters anymore." On the ground, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up beside the jet bridge. Two federal officers exited, one in a blazer, one in an FAA inspection uniform. Inside the terminal, the operations supervisor for the airline was already sweating through his collar. He stepped forward with a tablet in hand, but the taller officer raised a hand. "We'll speak to the crew first. Then the passenger." "And the press?" the supervisor asked. The agent shot him a flat look. "You might want to worry about policy, not PR." Back in the aircraft, passengers stirred when the cockpit door opened again. Captain Monroe emerged, his face unreadable. He didn't address the passengers, not yet. He walked to Marcello and murmured something under his breath. Marcello nodded and moved to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your continued patience. At this time, we're awaiting final clearance from ground control. Please remain seated. Crew will be coming through shortly with updates." A lie, one of necessity. The truth was coming soon enough. In seat 2A, Amara's phone buzzed. "Clara, they're at the gate. Stay seated. Don't speak unless spoken to. You've already said enough." She exhaled softly. Calm. Controlled. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt steady. Rooted. Like the ground she sat on had finally remembered it belonged to her, too. In the galley, Miss Dalton stood up. She walked to the mirror tucked beside the coffee pot and stared at her face. She didn't recognize it. All the years of routine, of smiling through storms, of managing difficult passengers, all of that had built a persona. But this moment, it broke it. Because what she'd always believed was instinct had been biased. And what she had called procedure had been assumption. And now, she wasn't facing an upset traveler. She was facing consequences. In first class, passengers began whispering again. The delay had gone on too long. The explanations are too thin. And as the realization spread, that this entire plane had stopped for one girl, they finally began to ask the real question. Not, why is this happening? But, why did it have to happen at all? The cabin door opened with a hiss that felt louder than any takeoff. Two figures stepped onto the aircraft, one in a crisp FAA uniform with silver insignia on the collar, the other in a charcoal suit, briefcase in hand. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Their presence was authority incarnate. They moved with purpose. The first-class cabin grew still. Passengers straightened in their seats, some instinctively adjusting their jackets, others glancing at Amara and then quickly looking away. Amara Benson, however, didn't move. She didn't even lift her eyes from the book resting on her lap, the same one she'd been using as a shield since the moment she was first humiliated. But now, it wasn't protection. It was punctuation. She was no longer defending herself. The system was defending itself against her. The FAA officer stopped beside her. "Miss Benson?" the woman asked gently. Amara looked up, eyes clear. "Yes. My name is Officer Rhodes. I'm here on behalf of Director Benson. You'll remain seated until the aircraft is cleared for disembarkation. You'll be the last to exit. Is that understood?" "Yes," Amara said evenly. The man beside her, the one in the suit, nodded at Officer Rhodes, then continued forward toward the galley. Passengers craned their necks, trying to follow him with their eyes. They didn't need an intercom announcement to know what was happening. Justice had boarded the plane. In the rear galley, Miss Dalton stood rigid, sweat beneath her uniform gathering like a second skin. She heard the footsteps before she saw the faces. When they appeared, the expression of the man in the suit gave her no comfort. "Miss Dalton," he said. She nodded once. "I'm Senior Investigator Mercer with FAA Compliance. You're being formally detained for questioning upon landing regarding the incident involving passenger 2A. Her lips trembled. "I apologized." "She's back in her seat." "This is no longer about the seat," Mercer replied. It's about why you removed her from it in the first place. In the first class, Marcelo watched from behind the curtain. The passengers around him were murmuring, but no one spoke Amara's name. It was as if they were afraid it might make her more powerful, as if naming what she represented would somehow implicate them. Because she had become more than a passenger. She had become evidence. In the airline's downtown headquarters, the crisis team was fully assembled. The large oak conference table was littered with printouts, passenger manifests, crew logs, copies of boarding passes, and early media reports. The television mounted on the wall played a breaking news segment. Sources confirm FAA investigators boarded Flight 719 after a black female passenger was removed from her assigned first-class seat. The passenger has been identified as Amara Benson, goddaughter of FAA Director Clara Benson. The CEO of the airline, Martin Raines, stood at the head of the table, arms folded. Has the crew been debriefed? Not yet, said the ethics officer. FAA's requesting isolation post-landing. They want unfiltered statements. And the flight status? Still grounded. No clearance for takeoff. Raines exhaled through his nose. This is going to cost us, someone muttered. Raines didn't respond. He already knew. And not just in dollars. On the aircraft, the man in the suit returned to Amara's row. He didn't speak. Just gave Officer Rhodes a small nod. It was time. Ladies and gentlemen, the intercom chimed again, this time with a voice that was unmistakably different from the crew, calm, precise, practiced government tone. This is FAA Investigator Mercer. We are concluding our compliance inspection. Upon landing, you will remain in your seats until instructed to disembark. Please do not interfere with our escort process. He paused. Thank you for your cooperation. The intercom clicked off. It wasn't a request. It was a warning. Passengers shifted uneasily. A woman in 4C whispered, "They're escorting someone." A man in the aisle seat nodded grimly. "No. They're escorting her." He gestured toward the front, not toward Amara, but toward Ms. Dalton, who was now visible through the parted curtain, pale and frozen. "She's the reason we never left the gate," he added. A younger passenger said softly, "She just ruined her whole career." But it wasn't said with mockery. It was said with sobering clarity. Like someone describing a natural consequence. Amara's phone buzzed once more. "Clara, you'll be the last to leave. Walk out calmly. Say nothing. They've already said enough." She locked the screen. The story wasn't hers to finish. It never was. She had only spoken the truth. And the rest was the system catching up to it. At the jet bridge, Ms. Dalton stepped off the plane between two agents. She wasn't in handcuffs. But she may as well have been. Her face was blank. Her stride, mechanical. And on either side of the narrow bridge, airline staff stood like walls, watching the downfall of one of their own. Not out of celebration. But out of something closer to recognition. They all knew that uniform. They all had the same training. But they also knew not all instincts were clean. In the cabin, passengers waited, unmoving. For once, no one was standing early. No one was gathering their bags too soon. They all sat still, facing forward, eyes half averted from the front. It felt wrong to be the first to move when you did nothing for the one who was moved first. Marcelo approached Amara one last time. His voice was soft, lower than ever. "They'll call you when it's time." She nodded once. "I know." He didn't linger. But he gave her something else, a small gesture. Not a smile. Not a compliment. But a subtle tilt of his head. Respect. The final announcement came over the intercom. Passengers will now begin disembarkation. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. Rows will be dismissed in order. The process began. Slowly. Row by row. Passenger by passenger. And with each row that exited, Amara remained. Still. Steady. No one rushed her. No one dared speak. They had watched her humiliation. Now, they were watching her resolve. At the gate, FAA officers stood waiting with clipboards and tablets. Others had already begun interviewing passengers who volunteered to speak, not many, but enough. Some wanted to confess. Some wanted to explain why they had looked away. Some wanted to say, I saw. I froze. I'm sorry. All of them had their reasons. None of them had excuses. When the last passenger stepped off the plane, the aisle was quiet again. Amara rose from her seat with the same grace she had boarded with hours earlier. Her bag was still light. Her steps were still even. But the weight she carried now wasn't hers. It belonged to them. Officer Rhodes greeted her at the door. Miss Benson. Amara nodded once. And walked out. Past the crew. Past the passengers now watching from the terminal. Past the reporters starting to gather behind velvet ropes. Her pace didn't change. Her silence didn't shift. Because when someone moves the system without raising their voice, the echo travels farther. And Amara Benson had just made history. By refusing to be erased from a seat that was always hers to begin with. The boardroom at the airline's headquarters was soundproof, but tension still seeped through the walls. Long after Flight 719 had been grounded, Martin Raines, CEO of Westbridge Air, stood at the head of the room, silently flipping through a printed document marked Confidential, FAA Compliance Escalation Report. No one dared interrupt him. The incident had already gone viral. Screens around the room displayed live coverage. Passenger removed from first class, FAA grounds entire aircraft. Teen woman of color humiliated, turns out she's FAA director's goddaughter. Airline faces national scrutiny after racism allegation on board Flight 719. The damage had been done. But the bleeding wasn't over. Where is she now? Raines finally asked. A junior executive replied, Amara Benson is in a secure debriefing room with her godmother. FAA is handling all passenger communication directly. And the crew? Interviewed separately. Ms. Dalton has been escorted to FAA legal holding for formal review. Raines nodded once. He didn't ask why. He already knew. At a separate location, the FAA's regional office in downtown Chicago, a different kind of meeting was underway. Inside a glass conference room, Clara Benson stood in front of a projection screen. Her navy suit was wrinkle-free. Her voice was calm. Her words, however, cut with precision. I'm not just here as her godmother, she said. I'm here because the policy you all approved, the one that claims every seat is earned, every passenger valued, was violated in front of witnesses, cameras, and now, the world. Beside her, FAA Legal Director Angela Holtz nodded. This is not an isolated incident, she added. This is a mirror. One we've avoided looking into for too long. Back at the airline, Raines leaned on the table. Walk me through exactly what she said, he ordered. The ethics officer opened her folder. She was calm. Never raised her voice. But when asked why she thought she'd been removed, she replied, quote, because I didn't look like someone who belonged there. A quiet wave moved through the room. She didn't yell, a PR director asked. No, the ethics officer replied. She didn't need to. That silence had become their indictment. Across the city, in a Federal Review room, Ms. Dalton sat under fluorescent lights. No uniform. No clipboard. No illusion of authority. Just a plain gray blouse, pale skin, and tired eyes. Across from her, 2 FAA compliance officers flipped through her record. "You've had a clean file," one of them said. "No formal complaints. Several commendations for in-flight crisis management." Ms. Dalton nodded numbly. "So," the officer continued, "tell us again, why did you single her out?" "I didn't think she belonged in first class." "Based on what?" "She was young. Alone. She didn't look like a first-class flyer." "You mean she was black?" The words hung in the air. Ms. Dalton looked down. "I didn't mean it that way." "But that's what you thought." She didn't respond. "You didn't scan her pass. You didn't verify with the ground. You didn't question the white man next to her." Silence. "This is no longer about policy, Ms. Dalton. It's about pattern." The airline's legal team drafted its first statement by noon. It was cautious, neutral, forgettable. "We are aware of an incident involving a misunderstanding in our first-class cabin. We are cooperating fully with FAA investigators and remain committed to the dignity of all passengers." Raines read it. Then tore it in half. "Do you think that's going to calm anyone down?" He stood. "We didn't have a misunderstanding. We had a breach of ethics witnessed by 24 passengers and now being dissected by millions online." He looked around. "We need to do better. Not just publicly. Structurally." Meanwhile, Amara sat quietly in a conference room beside Clara. Reporters were already outside. She could see their shadows behind the frosted windows. Camera flashes strobed faintly through the glass like distant lightning. But she didn't feel scared. She felt still. Clara poured herself a cup of tea. "You're not obligated to speak to them," she said softly. Amara nodded. "I know." Clara took a seat across from her. "I've seen dozens of cases like this," she said. "But never one where the entire plane was grounded before the victim even left her seat." Amara looked out the window. "I didn't even fight," she said. Clara shook her head. "You didn't have to." That afternoon, a second emergency meeting was held at Westbridge Air. This time, it wasn't just legal and PR. This time, every department head was required to attend. Operations. Flight staff management. Ethics. Training development. Diversity and inclusion. Raines stood at the head again. "This is no longer about one employee," he said. "It's about what we taught her to believe she could get away with." He turned to the director of crew training. "What do we teach about unconscious bias?" The director hesitated. "It's mentioned in the annual seminar." Raines raised an eyebrow. "Mentioned?" The director nodded reluctantly. "In a 10-minute video, with subtitles." Raines closed his eyes. 10 minutes. A 10-minute clip had failed to undo a lifetime of assumptions. Across social media, hashtags had begun trending. Hashtag Seat 2A. Hashtag She Belongs There. Hashtag Grounded by Truth. Clips from the flight had been uploaded. Passengers had recorded Amara walking off the plane, flanked by silence and watching eyes. One clip, only 12 seconds long, showed her pausing just before stepping through the exit. No sound. Just presence. It had over 6 million views in 3 hours. That evening, Westbridge Air issued a second, rewritten statement. "We failed a passenger. We failed our values." Miss Amara Benson was removed from her assigned seat without cause. We acknowledge this was an act of bias, and we are working closely with the FAA to ensure full accountability. Effective immediately, Westbridge Air will be implementing the following: mandatory bias response training for all flight crew, dual verification boarding procedures for all first-class assignments, direct reporting pathways to the FAA for discrimination concerns. We thank Miss Benson for her composure and courage. She reminded us that silence can be more powerful than any protest. We were grounded by the truth. Now, we rise only by earning back trust. Inside FAA headquarters, Clara reviewed the statement on her laptop. She didn't smile. She just closed the screen and looked at Amara, who sat curled in the corner chair, hoodie on, legs tucked beneath her. "They're starting to get it," Clara said. Amara exhaled. "Good." She sipped her tea. For the first time all day, she felt a little lighter. She didn't need an apology. She had something better. Proof. The video was only 12 seconds long. No sound. No text. No narration. Just a single frame of Amara Benson walking off the plane, her bag over one shoulder, her gaze forward, her steps calm. A silence followed her so heavy, it seemed to weigh down the entire gate. That clip, posted anonymously by a passenger on TikTok, had over 10 million views by the end of the day. Not because it was dramatic. Not because it showed outrage. But because it didn't. And somehow, that made it even more powerful. On Twitter, the hashtags surged. Hashtag grounded by truth. Hashtag seat 2A. Hashtag she belongs. Hashtag respect is a seatbelt. Each post carried more than an opinion, they carried reflection. People weren't just reacting. They were asking. Why did no one speak up? What would I have done? Why does silence feel like consent? By morning, civil rights leaders had issued statements. Advocacy groups had launched petitions. Corporate watchdogs had begun tracking airline accountability cases. It wasn't just a flight delay anymore. It was a cultural moment. Inside a high school auditorium in Atlanta, a social studies teacher projected the headline on a smartboard. FAA grounds flight over bias incident, passenger was right all along. She looked at her students. Today, she said, we're not going to read about Rosa Parks. We're going to talk about someone who just reminded us that the struggle never ended. She clicked play on the clip. The room went silent. No one laughed. No one looked away. When it ended, one girl raised her hand. She didn't yell, the girl said. No, the teacher replied. She didn't need to. At Westbridge Air headquarters, the communications director was flooded with media requests. CNN. NPR. BBC. A documentary producer from Netflix. A podcast host from The Atlantic. A civil rights panel from Georgetown University. Everyone wanted Amara. But she didn't want them. She didn't want interviews. Didn't want photo shoots. Didn't want to become the face of a campaign. Because that was never the goal. She hadn't boarded the plane to make a point. She just wanted to go home. Clara knew better than to push her. You don't owe anyone your trauma, she had told her. Let the story work. You don't have to. So Amara stayed quiet. And still. Her silence kept making noise. A week after the flight, Westbridge Air launched a new initiative. The 2A reform policy. It included mandatory monthly anti-bias training for all flight crews. Real-time incident reporting dashboards monitored by FAA liaisons. A passenger dignity clause is written into the employee handbook. A zero-tolerance standard for seat-related discrimination. And in bold, at the bottom. Every seat comes with accountability. It wasn't just PR. It was the beginning of a shift. Because when corporations are forced to look in the mirror, change stops being optional. Amara read about the policy on her phone while sipping ginger tea on the back porch. It was quiet. The cicadas were louder than the headlines. Clara was inside on another Zoom call, probably speaking to the Department of Transportation. But Amara didn't feel pride. Or satisfaction. Just peace. For the first time in days, she breathed without her chest tightening. She didn't smile. But her fingers relaxed around the mug. That evening, Clara joined her on the porch. They added your name to the training materials, she said gently. Amara looked over. My name? Clara nodded. They call it the Benson Protocol. Not for me. For you. Amara blinked. I didn't do anything. Clara leaned back in her chair. Exactly. And that's why it matters. At a university campus in California, a group of law students held a roundtable titled Bias at 30,000 Feet, a Case Study of Flight 719. One student pulled up the transcript from the FAA report. She was removed because of an assumption, he said. Another added, and no one challenged it. Not the passengers. Not the crew. A third student raised her hand. But she didn't sue. She didn't file a public grievance. The room paused. Then the professor, a former civil rights attorney, spoke. She didn't need to. Her presence did the work. Her silence made the system move. Back at the FAA, Clara reviewed a memo from the White House's Office of Public Engagement. They wanted Amara to attend a roundtable on racial equity in transportation. Not to speak. Just to be present. Clara showed her the invitation. Amara read it quietly. Will it help others? She asked. Clara tilted her head. It might. Amara thought for a long moment. Then nodded. I'll go. But before that, she did something unexpected. She accepted a private invitation from a local community center to speak to a group of high school girls. No cameras. No hashtags. No podium. Just 18 chairs in a circle and a room full of questions. The first question came from a girl wearing a hoodie not unlike Amara's. Were you scared? Amara paused, then nodded. Yes. But not the way you think. I wasn't scared of her. I was scared of going quiet inside. Another girl asked, what kept you calm? Amara smiled faintly. Knowing I didn't do anything wrong. And knowing someone, even just one person, would believe me. A third girl, barely 15, whispered, do you feel powerful now? Amara looked around the room. No, she said. I feel awake. After the session, the organizer approached Clara in the hallway. She may not want the spotlight, she said softly, but she's already holding a torch. Clara smiled, then added. She didn't want to lead a movement. But the truth has a way of following those who carry it with grace. In an internal airline training module, one of the last slides read. Dignity isn't something passengers earn. It's something they already have. Your job is to protect it. Because sometimes, one seat can cost an entire airline its integrity. The final image showed a shadowed outline of a young woman in seat 2A. No name. No logo. Just presence. And far from the screens, the debates, the policy drafts, Amara returned to the quiet parts of her life. She still rode the bus. Still wore hoodies. Still kept her headphones on and her head down when the world grew too noisy. But something had changed. Not in how she moved through the world. But in how the world moved around her. More aware. More careful. More accountable. One morning, weeks later, on a routine flight to visit her aunt, a flight attendant leaned toward her with a soft smile. "Miss Benson." Amara looked up, startled. "I just wanted to say, thank you," the woman said. "We watched your story in training. It changed how I see everything." Amara blinked, unsure how to respond. So she simply nodded and said, "Thank you." The woman smiled again and moved on. No second glance. No awkward pause. Just recognition. And that flight. No one questioned her seat. No one asked for extra proof. No one assumed she didn't belong. It was quiet. It was peaceful. It was how it should have always been. It started with a seat. Simple. Assigned. Paid for. Earned. But somehow, to someone, that seat had become a question mark. A challenge. A threat. And to Amara Benson, that seat, 2A, became something far greater. It became a mirror. One that reflected not just her, but everyone around her. The flight crew. The passengers. The executives. Even the strangers watching from their screens. Everyone had to look into it. Some didn't like what they saw. But they saw it anyway. Months had passed since the flight. The news cycle had moved on. The hashtags had faded from the top of the feed. New controversies had claimed the headlines. But in quiet places, classrooms, boardrooms, airports, the impact remained. At Westbridge Air, the crew briefings began differently now. "Remember the 2A standard," the captain said. "Check assumptions before tickets. Bias doesn't fly with us." And recruits were required to read through a case file during training. Flight 719. The Amara Report. Not as punishment. But from a perspective. Amara returned to her quiet rhythms. She didn't campaign. She didn't hold press conferences. She didn't build a platform. But her story did. And now and then, she'd hear it. In a whisper from a stranger in a bookstore, "You reminded me not to shrink." In a letter from a girl in Detroit, "They told me I didn't belong in the robotics club. I stayed. I got the scholarship." In a comment on a blog, "I teach airline staff. I rewrote our entire module after seeing what happened to you." And Amara? She simply lived. She didn't chase a spotlight. She just stopped hiding from it. One morning, she walked into a lecture hall for her first semester of university. Engineering major. Renewable tech concentration. Her backpack was heavier than she liked, her curls pinned up in a scarf. She sat near the back, just behind a boy tapping rapidly on a tablet. The professor began with an introduction. But before diving into thermodynamics, he paused. "There's someone in this room," he said, "whose quiet strength helped shape policy at 30,000 feet. She didn't raise her voice. She held her ground. Because of that, we all sat up straighter." The room hushed. Amara froze. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. He just continued. "Remember that silence isn't always absence. Sometimes, it's the sound of courage holding its breath." Amara didn't look around. She just opened her notebook. And began. Meanwhile, in a private security room at Westbridge International Airport, a newly hired gate agent reviewed internal footage from past flights as part of training. Her supervisor clicked play on a file labeled "Case Study, Passenger Dignity Breakdown, Flight 719. The agent watched the moment a young woman was told to leave her seat. Watched her quietly walk the aisle. Watched her text. Watched the ripple begin. "Why are we watching this?" the trainee asked. The supervisor replied, "Because that girl grounded a plane without raising her voice. And if you don't understand how, you shouldn't be working at a gate." In Washington, D.C., Amara Benson stood before a joint advisory panel on transportation reform. Her presentation wasn't flashy. No dramatic charts. No emotional appeals. Just one slide. A still image. Seat 2A. Empty. Clara looked at the room full of policymakers. "For years," she said, "we wrote guidelines to prevent disruption. But we never asked ourselves what dignity looked like in practice." She clicked. The next slide showed Amara boarding, calm, composed, invisible to the chaos about to unfold. Then the third slide, Amara seated again in 2A, surrounded by silence, but undeniably present. Clara said. She didn't get her seat back because we gave it to her. She got it back because the system finally remembered she never should have lost it. On the anniversary of the flight, Westbridge Air held a private event for staff. It wasn't a celebration. It was a reflection. They read testimonies from passengers, including one from a woman who had witnessed Amara being removed and said nothing. She wrote, "I watched her walk to the back, and I did nothing. But I think about her every time I see someone take a seat that others say they don't deserve. And now, I speak. I learned from her silence that my own could be a weapon if I wasn't careful. She didn't need us to rescue her. She needed us not to abandon her." Amara never forgot the flight. Not because it hurt. But because it showed her something no book or lecture ever could. That the smallest act of holding your place, in line, in life, in principle, could unravel a thread so tangled, it reached to power. That a seat wasn't just about comfort. It was about recognition. One Sunday afternoon, Amara and Clara walked through the terminal on their way to another conference. As they passed gate B14, a little girl tugged her mother's sleeve. "Mom," she whispered, pointing toward Amara. "That's her, isn't it?" The mother turned, eyes wide. She gave a soft nod. "Yes," she said. "That's the one who didn't move." The girl's face lit up. "She looks normal." Clara laughed. "She is." And as they walked, Amara glanced at the departure board. Flight 719 was flying again. Same route. Same number. New crew. And in seat 2A. A young boy. Earbuds in. Shoes kicked off. Fast asleep. No one questioned him. No one stared. No one asked for his ticket. That, Amara thought, was the victory. Not that she had changed the world. But that someone else didn't have to fight for their seat. Later that night, in a handwritten note taped to her dorm wall, Amara wrote, "I didn't raise my voice. But I was heard. And maybe that's the loudest kind of justice." She folded the paper, slid it into her journal, and turned out the light. The world outside kept turning. Flights kept taking off. And for once, everyone knew exactly where she belonged. The story of Amara Benson reminds us that strength doesn't always speak in loud voices, it often whispers through quiet courage in moments of injustice. A single seat on a plane may seem insignificant, but when unjustly taken, it became a symbol of dignity, resilience, and silent resistance. Amara didn't scream. She didn't demand. She simply stayed grounded in truth, and that truth was powerful enough to halt an entire system and spark lasting change. In a world where bias and assumption still lurk in everyday spaces, this story challenges us to rethink what justice looks like. You don't have to be loud to be heard. But you do have to stand, sometimes silently, for what's right. Sometimes, just staying in your seat when someone tells you to move is the most revolutionary act of all. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, even just for a moment, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Because change doesn't always start with noise. Sometimes, it begins with one person refusing to be invisible. And that could be you.